So we started a series just last week. We finished up a Christmas series, and then we started a series. It's going to be a journey through the book of Matthew, and it's called The Kingdom of God, Building a Present Reality and a Future Hope. And I kind of explained some last week. We did an introduction to the series and an introduction to kind of Matthew, who at least history tells us Matthew the Apostle was the author of this gospel. And so we talked about some of those things, but with a title like this, it's not just going to be an informational thing. It's one of those things where hopefully we're going to see two things. One, we're going to see who Jesus really is, and it's going to challenge us because if we're following Jesus, we want to become more like he is. And so there's going to be that angle. But also, when Jesus was on earth, he was building this reality. He even told the Pharisees, look around, the kingdom of God is among you. Because different elements of his kingdom were surrounding them even during his time on earth. But there is also, at least I personally believe, this future hope that we have to look forward to as well concerning God's kingdom. So there's different nuances of that. But part of it is we can be actively advancing Jesus and his cause here on earth even now as a church community, as individuals. And so this is very much a call to action book and a call to imitation book, not just for your information only. And so hopefully we'll all be challenged in those ways. But we're going to begin as we get into chapter 1, verses 1 to 17 today by taking a look at a king. And this king is Jesus. And King Jesus is a king like no other, which is kind of refreshing because as great as some kings that this world has experienced have been, and as tragic as others have been, Jesus Christ eclipses all of them. I think it would be hard for me to pledge my allegiance to an earthly king. But this king isn't merely human. This king was God in the flesh. And we're going to see different aspects unfold over the next few weeks that I think are going to persuade us that this king, Jesus, he's a king we can all get behind. He's a king we can love because he's a king who desperately loves us. And he treats us unlike any earthly ruler ever would. And so hopefully those aspects of who Jesus is are going to draw us all toward him and help us get on board with this king, whereas, earthly leaders maybe because of their flaws, like we all have, are more difficult to get on board. And so I've titled this, I realize this might be a little charged, A King Like No Other, an Inclusive King. That word inclusive is kind of maybe a buzzword in our culture because depending on culture and political viewpoints and uses, context, it can mean several different things. But I want to kind of give you a definition that'll head you in the direction that I'm headed this morning with that. Inclusive in the sense of aiming to provide equal access to opportunities and resources for people who might otherwise be excluded or marginalized. So this king is not just going to be a champion of the people that everybody likes to like. This king is going to be a champion of people that oftentimes get excluded or pushed to the margins, either because of their choices or because of who they are in society, being overlooked. And so we're going to see this King Jesus, he approaches people in a little bit different way. He includes people that many of us would feel honestly more comfortable excluding and pushing away, which is going to be challenging to us. Cyrus II of Persia, he was called Cyrus the Great in history, and he reigned from 559 to 530 BC, so quite a while ago in the past. He was a very different kind of king in contrast with other kings who had gone before him. Most of the kings in this time period, the Babylonian Empire, the Persian Empire, the Assyrian Empire, they were very ruthless kings. They ruled by fear. They would approach people, surround their cities, besiege them, and as soon as they were hungry enough or they had figured out a way into the city or the city surrendered, the kings would take those people and relocate them to a totally different part of the empire or punish them or make them examples. There'd be a lot of suffering that these kings were behind to facilitate their own goals in the end. But when Cyrus stepped into history, he had a different approach. This is what it says concerning him and of him in a cylinder. It's called the Cyrus cylinder, and so it was actually written in the time period he ruled about him. He shepherded with justice and righteousness. He entered Babylon without fighting or a battle. He saved Babylon from hardship, whereas other kings would have decimated them and thrown more hardship upon them. It says, by his aid the dead were revived, and all who had been redeemed from the hardship and difficulty greeted him with gladness and praised his name. Can you imagine? Your city's about ready to be taken over by this king who's an enemy, and instead of coming in and making you all slaves, he comes in and he's gentle, and he's considerate, and he thinks about your needs, unlike any other. He says, my vast army marched into Babylon in peace. I didn't permit anyone to frighten the people. I sought the welfare of the city and all of its sacred centers. As for the citizens, I relieved their weariness, and I freed them from their service. He says, my God, speaking of his idol that he worshiped, rejoiced over my good deeds, and in peace before him we moved around in friendship. He goes on to talk about how he let people stay in their lands all throughout the empire, essentially continue to rule themselves to a degree and worship their own gods in their own countries and lands. So he was a very considerate king because he was kind of an inclusive king. He didn't try to push everybody into his mold, and he didn't make certain people more important than other people. And I want to propose to you this morning that from what we're going to read today, and it's actually, of all things, it's a genealogy. It's a list of names, Jesus' ancestors. But it's going to show us, I think, that he's a king, Jesus is, who finds great value in a very diverse set of followers, something that most kings view as a threat. Most kings don't want variety. They want people just like them. But Jesus, he's a very different kind of king. So I want to show a few things in this genealogy that I believe show that. I'm going to learn 3 things about Christ today in this sense of being inclusive. First of all, he's very intentional about redeeming people. I was a youth pastor before I worked here. I came here to Mountain View. And during the time that I was a youth pastor, every year we organized this annual yard sale, rummage sale, garage sale, however you term it. And so people throughout our church family, they would all go through their closets and their garages and pull out all the stuff that they never used anymore, that was worthless or worn out. And then they would bring it over to our church or even call us and say, would you bring a trailer over and pick up our junk, basically, take it over. And then we would sell it to try to make money to fund some of the activities that we did as a youth group throughout the next year. And every year there was a woman, and the day before we would always set out our items, we were pricing our items, and we had signs that said when we would open up the next day. And there was a lady in our town who would always stop by, and she would sort of do the pre-show, the pre-sale. She'd be looking around, and sometimes she wouldn't always get out of her car. She'd just park across the street and kind of scope it out and see what kinds of things we had. And then our yard sale opened at 7 o'clock in the morning. We were pretty firm about that, about not doing business before that. But even though year after year we let people know it starts at 7, every year at 6:40 she'd pull in. She'd start looking, maybe she'd walk around. She wouldn't necessarily try to buy something, but she'd have her eye on things. And as soon as 7 o'clock hit, she'd have several things. I want this, this, and this, and this. And then we'd load it up and she'd be gone on to the next sale. But the reason why she did that was because she was an intentional redeemer. You see, she had an eye for things that she could fix up. These things that other people didn't want at all. She knew, I can make something valuable out of this. I can restore its value or sometimes make it even more valuable than it started out to be in the first place by doing some finishing touches, by doing some repainting or things of that nature. And so she would take these items, she would redeem them and build their value up again, and then she would sell them for more money and make money, which is why she did it. She was concerned about a profit ultimately. Jesus, he's not really concerned about a profit, but he is concerned about improving our condition, which is something that honestly has been faded because of the sin that surrounds us and has entered into the world almost from the beginning. And so we're going to look into this first of all, and we're going to be introduced to this King Jesus as somebody who is, again, intentional about redeeming us out of our fallen condition. This is how this passage starts. And again, you're going to hear this and think, what am I in for? Do I really want to sit and listen through this? Because it starts out the record of the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah. Sometimes we get into genealogies, we like to discover things about our family, but quite honestly, hearing a list of 42 generations of somebody else's family is not all that enticing. But that's what we come to today. So I'm going to try to keep it light, although I will try to read through it at one point in time just to give you context. But it says the record of the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah. And that term Jesus, we think of it as Jesus' name, but really it's the Greek form of a Hebrew term, Joshua or Yeshua, and it meant the Lord is salvation. So it's telling us more about Jesus' purpose than it is just giving us a first name, so to speak. Jesus, the Lord is salvation. He stepped into humanity to rescue our lives and our world and our eternity from the curse of sin. That's what he came to redeem. Ultimately, it was our lives and how sin affects us and destroys our life, our world and how sin affects and destroys the world around us on a natural level, on a spiritual level, and ultimately our eternity, and how the curse of sin that started with Adam and Eve's choice to disobey the Lord how it even wrecks our eternity. And Jesus came to try to reverse that, to redeem that, to buy it out of its condition. And that's the first thing that we notice about this king. That's what he came to do, to redeem us, to pull us out. At this point, I want to just read through this genealogy. I'm going to do it quickly, just so you have a reference and context. It's up here on the screen so you can look along, and I'm not going to camp out on it because it would be tedious, but we're going to refer back to parts of it, and so I want you to know it. It says, Abraham fathered Isaac. A lot of these names will be familiar if you've read the Old Testament somewhat. Isaac fathered Jacob, and Jacob fathered Judah and his brothers. Judah fathered Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Perez fathered Hezron, and Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Amminadab, and Amminadab fathered Nahshon, and Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. If you've read the book of Ruth, that name rings a bell, by Rahab. Boaz fathered Obed by Ruth. Obed fathered Jesse, who we know is David, King David's father. Jesse fathered David the king. David fathered Solomon by her who had been the wife of Uriah. Solomon fathered Rehoboam. Rehoboam fathered Abijah. Abijah fathered Asa. Asa fathered Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat fathered Joram. And Joram fathered Uzziah. These are all kings in the nation of Judah, the south part of the kingdom of Israel. Uzziah fathered Jotham. Jotham fathered Ahaz. And Ahaz fathered Hezekiah. Hezekiah fathered Manasseh. Again, more kings in Judah. Manasseh fathered Ammon. And Ammon fathered Josiah. Josiah fathered Jeconiah and his brothers at the time of the deportation to Babylon. So now we've gone this whirlwind trip from Abraham all the way through a lot of these different generations to the point where Israel and Judah have been carted off into captivity by Assyria, with Israel first and Judah off to Babylon. And then it gives us a list that takes us all the way to Joseph, the husband of Mary. It says, after the deportation, Jeconiah fathered Shealtiel, and he fathered Zerubbabel, and Zerubbabel fathered Abihud. Abihud fathered Eliakim, and Eliakim fathered Azor. Azor fathered Zadok. Zadok fathered Achim. Achim fathered Eliud. Eliud fathered Eleazar. Eleazar fathered Mathan, and Mathan fathered Jacob. Jacob fathered Joseph, and this takes us to our Christmas story from a few weeks ago, the husband of Mary, by whom Jesus was born, who's called the Messiah. So now that we've gone through that, we have a little bit of context. We're not going to go back to those lists of names, but we're going to refer to it. Here's another way that Jesus was an intentional redeemer. Not only did he come to redeem us and our lives in this world and our eternities from sin, but he also caused the failures of 42 plus generations. Think about that. I don't know how far back you can trace your own lineage, but generation after generation after generation, a few of them were good and influential and godly people. Most of them, however, had flaws or made pretty grave mistakes, even if they were followers of the Lord as well. But God took all these failures and he caused them to culminate, to peak, to end up in the arrival of his son. He could take all these problems, all these shortcomings, and cause it to result in Jesus being brought into the world. That's an amazing God, and that's an intentional redeemer. Isaac and Jacob, they were names in the list. They had favorite children. How many of you have favorite children? Don't raise your hand, right? Especially if they're with you. We try to avoid favoritism as parents, right? If I told my daughter or my son, you're the favorite, we'd have problems around the house. But they had obvious favorites. Judah broke a very, very important promise. We might get to some of the details of that later. David committed adultery and he committed murder. Solomon was very excessive. He had the money and the resources to try any pleasure he wanted, to try to find satisfaction in this life. Didn't find it in this life. He was drawn into idol worship by his 700 wives. It's a lot of wives. It's a lot of spouses. Rehoboam, he divided God's nation. How about that? What was your life accomplishment? I divided God's nation. His son Abijah started a civil war in Israel. That's a great mark of your life. Uzziah became so prideful at his accomplishments that he went into the temple and offered incense like the priests were supposed to, and he was stricken with leprosy for the rest of his life. Ahaz turned the nation of Israel toward worshiping the idol Baal. Manasseh sacrificed his kids and practiced sorcery. Not exactly a track record or a family line that seems like it would amount to something good, right, at points. Now, there were people in there, again, who lived godly lives, scattered in the midst. But this isn't exactly the lineage that you would choose, probably, if you were God, of which to send this Redeemer, this deliverer, your son Jesus Christ. But God intentionally included this very imperfect list and a list of sometimes downright wicked people to lead to his deliverer. So I want to pause and say, why? Why would God do something like that? I mean, I don't claim to know the mind of God. I don't think we'll ever exhaust that. But I thought of a few possibilities, and so I'll throw them out at you for consideration this morning. Why would God do that? Maybe it's so we would realize that he's not limited by our lot in life or our past trauma that we've been through or our poor choices, of which many of his ancestors made many, or even our family tree. God's not limited by that. And I recognize sometimes we do make mistakes and poor choices, and we face consequences, but God can even take our past mistakes, and he can orchestrate our past mistakes and the consequences that we face. He can orchestrate that into something that still accomplishes his will. And that's encouraging, because I would dare say that we all have times in our past that we would not want to relive, wouldn't want to go back there. And we may even think, because of it, I don't feel very usable by God. But he can overcome even that. And I think that's encouraging, because again, he's this intentional redeemer. Also, perhaps it was so we would glory in him and not ourselves. It's really easy to give ourselves credit, But God sometimes uses, it says in 1 Corinthians, the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. So people give the credit to God and not themselves. And so maybe God had people like this in the list so that we would know it's him who does the work. Perhaps it was to show us that he desires to draw all people to himself. God uses all these people, and he desired that they come to him. Some people never did, but he wanted it. And maybe that's to teach us a lesson so that we'll want to draw all people to ourselves also. Because isn't it easier to exclude people than to include people, especially people that we see as less perfect than we are, Perhaps it was so we would give opportunities to other people who might fail or even misuse those opportunities altogether. Sometimes we want to protect things, and we think, well, if I turn this over to this person, if I let them have this role or this responsibility, they're going to mess it up. Look at the track record. But God allows people into this genealogy who he knows are going to make these terrible mistakes, and he lets it happen. He even let Judas into his group of 12 apostles, even though he knew that Judas would betray him. Why would he do something like that? Perhaps it was so we would know that we are loved, useful, and able to trust him in our own flawed condition, because we all see our flaws. And sometimes we think, what does God think of me? Does he want any relationship? Does he want any part? Because he knows my imperfections. But we realize I can trust him, because this God included imperfect people in the past. So maybe he would include me. Another king would say, I just want the best. But King Jesus, he's an intentional redeemer. He includes imperfect people. And that's something that I think is encouraging to us and also challenging to us, because we're supposed to reflect that and imitate that. Let me give you a second thing about this king and his inclusion, something that kind of is different about this record. This is a very irregular record, a very irregular genealogy. I heard about the nation of Iceland. Iceland is a volcanically active nation in the North Atlantic. And it really wasn't very populated until some Norse settlers arrived in the 800s AD. And they built this group of people. A lot of them were pretty interrelated to one another. And they were really well organized, but they kept great records of their people. And so they have currently records that go back about 1,000 years in Iceland as far as people's histories and genealogies. And there's a group of researchers in 1997 in Iceland that put together a database called the Book of Icelanders, and it has records, family records of 95% of their current population, which is maybe 320 or 330,000 people in the nation of Iceland. And a great number of that population of people are related. It's kind of hard to tell who's related because the last names aren't like ours where maybe we keep it for generations. You would take your father's name and you would add daughter to the end of it or son to the end of it. So my father's name is Richard, and so I would be Jason Richard's son. So you can't really tell, again, if your name is based on your father's name, your last name is, you can't really tell who's related to who. And so this database, they actually, somebody created an app recently, and it's for young people who are looking to date someone. So you load this app on your phone, and it's got records of 95% of the people in your nation. And before you ask somebody out, you touch your phone up toward theirs, and there's an alarm that goes off if you're too closely related. So you don't get into any trouble, and so you don't have this really irregular record of a family tree that kind of goes like this with the branches. That's how they avoid that irregularity. And this family tree of Jesus, it's also kind of an irregular one, not because of cousins that are a little bit too close, but for some other reasons. There's some uniquenesses about this genealogy that make it stand out from others. First of all, in verse 1, it says that Jesus is the son of David. Jesus came to fulfill God's promise to David. That's what this phrase is connecting back to. This covenant God made with David about 1,000 years prior to this. Jesus is the son of David. He is the fulfillment of that promise to David. So in 2 Samuel 7, God told David that his family line and his kingdom and his throne would be established forever. That was the promise God made. And it seemed like God kind of reneged on that promise, because once the Israelites were deported, the people of Judah were deported to Babylon, that kingly line and that kingship kind of ceased at that point in time in history. But we find through this record that God is about to keep this promise through Jesus. Verse 16 of that genealogy, it said, Jacob fathered Joseph, the husband of Mary, by whom, and that's feminine, so it's talking about by Mary, by whom, by Mary, Jesus was born, who is called the Messiah. And this whole record was proof that Jesus inherited the right to the throne of Israel. But it was in a very unique way, because typically a father would inherit that right to be king, or a son would inherit that right to be king from his father. So it was a biological son that would become king, normally the firstborn, generation after generation after generation after generation. But when the kingship stopped, the family line didn't stop. And so Joseph, the husband of Mary, was actually in that royal line, a direct descendant of the kings of Israel, and he was in line, so to speak, legally for the throne of Israel. And so with Mary, with her marriage to Joseph, Jesus was included. By marriage, Jesus became the adopted son of Joseph, so to speak, and he became a legal heir to the throne of Israel, someone that could fulfill that promise as the son of David. Another thing that's really unique about Jesus' genealogy is if Jesus had been a descendant, a direct physical descendant of the kingly line of Judah, and not a legal heir through Mary's marriage to Joseph, he actually would have been disqualified. And this is something new that I didn't know actually before this last week. The last king was Jeconiah, and then they got deported to Babylon, and the line of kings stopped. And this is a prophecy that was given through Jeremiah the prophet to Jeconiah. It said, is this man, Jeconiah, a despised, broken idol, a vessel in which is no pleasure? Why are they cast out, he and his descendants, cast out into a land that they don't know? And this was Babylon. O earth, 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 hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord, write this man, Jeconiah, down as childless, a man who shall not prosper in his days, for none of his descendants shall prosper, sitting on the throne of David and ruling any more in Judah. He wasn't physically childless, but God's prophecy was that none of Jeconiah's descendants would ever sit on the throne of David. It seemed like God shot himself in the foot. God, who had said, I will make some of David's heirs, this kingly line, a king forever, and now he says nobody else who is a descendant of this person is going to become king. So is God contradicting himself? He's actually not, because Jesus was not a direct descendant through Joseph. He was a legal heir through Mary's marriage to Joseph. And so it's a very peculiar twist, but it proves that Jesus was the rightful heir and also qualified because he wasn't a direct descendant of the kingly line. And so that's one reason why this is a very unique sort of list of ancestors, a unique genealogy. But there's another reason why this genealogy is really unusual, and I think this is maybe pertinent to us even more. I want to tell you about genealogies in the past. One of the biggest genealogies in the world, what country do you think it might exist in? The biggest family tree, so to speak. Longest period of time, most names. What country? Okay, I got England, Israel, where? Iraq. Let's go China on this. Confucius. Confucius was a very popular Chinese philosopher. And so they kept track of his descendants. And if you look at the Guinness Book of World Records, I think his family tree, as of 2007, there were 3 million descendants on the family tree of Confucius. You know what was unique about that genealogy? All the descendants were males. Now, all of his descendants weren't really males, but those were the only ones who made the genealogy. In Egypt, the Egyptian genealogy, this is 8th century BC, of Anakhef and Sekhmet. I don't know if I got that name right. It only contains the names of males. If you look in the book of Genesis, there are a couple genealogies with Adam, his descendants, and Noah's descendants. And guess what? The only proper names that are included are names of males. The Sumerian kings list, probably the oldest genealogy we have of kings, dates to 2000 BC. It mentions the dynasty of 134 male kings and the cities over which they ruled. Genealogies were lists of fathers and sons and grandsons and great-grandsons, but women were excluded. But there's something really unique about this list of Jesus' genealogy. It includes 5 women. And not just 5 women, 4 of those women were most likely Gentiles. Some we know for sure were, one we have a question on, but probably was. So 4 out of those 5 women were not even members of the nation of Israel. And so Matthew really bucks the trend of genealogy with this. Tamar, she's a Canaanite who disguised herself as a prostitute to keep her family line continued. Rahab was in Jericho, a city that was destined for God's destruction. She also had an occupation as a prostitute. Ruth was a noble and godly woman, but from the land of Moab, a land that had been excluded from marrying into the nation of Israel. Bathsheba was a Gileadite. She was a Canaanite woman who was married to Uriah, who was a Hittite, who was one of David's important soldiers. Mary, she was a Jew, and she was a favored one, but she was a woman as well. And all of these women made the list. And I think sometimes God uses his word to draw our attention to things that people, even people in the culture, would have overlooked. And that was that he's going to choose to highlight the roles that women played in his plan to send a deliverer. And so when you think about this King Jesus, especially historically, he's a contrast. Because King Jesus, he includes women. And after all, that makes sense because he created them along with men in his image. The final thing that we see about Jesus and this king is that his realm, it's a little bit broader than what we think of with other kings. Most kings have a kingdom and it's got very defined boundaries, but Jesus is king over an international realm. The last phrase in verse 1 says that Jesus is the son of Abraham. And again, the son of Abraham, he's not a son of Abraham, he is the son of Abraham. In Genesis 12, God gave a promise to Abraham. He said way back almost 2,000 years before the time of Christ, in you, Abram, all the nations of the world, all the families of the earth, they're going to be blessed. And so, the son of Abraham, Jesus Christ, comes on the scene nearly 2,000 years later to fulfill that promise, to invite people from every nation to be a part of his kingdom. But it's more than that. It's to actually intentionally be a blessing to the people from other nations. Because it's no longer about Israel. Now it's about Jesus' church. And Jesus' church is all-encompassing, all the peoples of the world. Because he's the son of Abraham. He's the one who will purposefully ensure that people from all nations have access to God. And not just access, but blessing. I could stop this right here and put another commercial in, because as I mentioned earlier, there's this opportunity that we have to bless people from different nations. These students that are coming over, again, toward the end of February and mid-March. I don't say that as a guilt trip because I feel like people need to make decisions because the Lord is leading them to, not because there's any sense of pressure. But it is a unique opportunity that we have, I would say, to be like Jesus, to be a blessing on people, not just from our own nationality, but from the scope of an international realm. What's interesting, too, as I mentioned, several people in this genealogy are not Jewish. They go beyond that scope. The 4 women, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba, were of different nationalities, but even Abraham himself was kind of before the time of Israel. It hadn't become a nation, and Abraham's family would become that nation, but he was of another place. And so, as well, King Jesus, he includes all nations. And so I would ask, how do we make the most of our opportunities with people of other nations? And I think what's important to point out here too is when Jesus looks at people, he doesn't see people who are international, who are maybe not citizens of this country, through the lens of politics or religion. He sees people who are created in his image. And from the Old Testament, we know that he sees them as guests. The strangers, the people from other nations who were in Israel, God actually called guests in the books of the law, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And so I think it's important that when it comes to us as a church, that we also are able to see people and treat people from other nations the way that God sees them, so that we can reflect our King and we can reflect his kingdom. And even though you may have political opinions about people from other nations, or personal opinions, or even potentially prejudices about people from other nations, or fears, depending on what the religions of those people from other nations might be, it's important that when we see people as a church, we look through the lens of our King and our God. And above all, we see them as people created in his image, people who are our guests among us, and people who Jesus ultimately would become a blessing to. And so maybe we should make that our focus of how we can be a blessing to the nations around us, as our King Jesus also does. So this concludes with an interesting verse. It talks about how all the generations from Abraham to David are 14. All the generations from David to the deportation in Babylon are 14. And all the generations from Babylon to the Messiah are 14. What's interesting is that there's actually more generations than that in between there. If you go and count all the kings, some of them got left out of the genealogy. So we know it's not because of a literal sense that this number 14 is used. And so it begs the question, why did Matthew list 14 people in each category? 14 is an interesting number in the Old Testament. The 14th of the month was the day that God made this promise to Abraham about him becoming a blessing eventually to all the nations. The 14th day of the month is the day that Passover is observed on. Both of those things really speak deliverance. And then the 14 is also the numerical value of the name David, because each Hebrew letter also contained a numerical value. Instead of having numbers and letters, their letters were letters and their letters were also numbers. And so David, this fact that Jesus is the son of David, his name was also a 14. And I think possibly it's meant to say, in case you thought God needed perfect people and males and citizens of Israel to bring deliverance, because 14 was a number associated with God's deliverance, all these people are a part of deliverance, because there's 3 14s. God needed all of this. God used all of this to bring about his deliverance. So what do we do with something like this? A list of genealogies. How do you get challenges from that? I want to propose 3 things as we close today, maybe action steps that we can take or ways we can look at our own lives. Things to think about. First of all, if there's room for this kind of diversity of people in Jesus' genealogy and in God's kingdom, first of all, there's room for you too, because maybe you're imperfect, like I am. I dare say like we all are. Maybe you're a woman. Maybe you're an international. Maybe you're one of a number of other things that people like to exclude. But you realize this King Jesus, in his kingdom, you're included. There's room for you. Secondly, if Jesus was willing to include such a diversity of people in his plan in his kingdom, what right do we have to be exclusive in our church community? So we have to be aware of people different than us, people who might be pushed to the margins, to the edges, or ignored or overlooked or not given a voice. Thirdly, what can I do to create an atmosphere where imperfect people, women, international guests, etc., feel included? Why might they not currently feel included or like they belong in our church community? And that's just an assessment. I'm not saying that they don't, but there's always a potential or ways for us to improve. What changes can we make to correct our divergence, our stepping away from the way that Jesus is? Because he's a king, but he's a very inclusive one in that sense. Let's go ahead and pray today. God, I thank you for the comfort of knowing that we too can be included in your kingdom. We can trust you. You want us. We belong. Help us to have that same heart and extend that same heart that you have to others in Christ's name. Amen.